Oh, notification. Oh, look at that. It's a moment email introducing our daily deals. How coincidental. Howdy, this is Kearns here. I'm hydrated now, and we're gonna talk about wide angle photography. I'll be using my cellular device with my cellular wide lens, which is the iPhone 11 Pro with the moment wide, and we'll also be shooting some DSLR today. I'll be covering things like composition, how I shoot indoors and how wide angle benefits that, but also how I photograph people on a wide angle. And I don't know what it is, but some people are just like, don't take portraits, don't photograph people on wide angle, and I think that's baloney. And I actually really enjoy the results I can get photographing people with a wide angle lens. So we'll get into that, we'll get into much more. And the thing is, this is my process. These aren't rules written in stone. These aren't something you have to follow. So take what you want, leave what you don't. But with that, let's get into it. So my first tip is think about your composition. And this doesn't just apply to wide angle, this applies to any photo you ever take. I tend to gravitate toward a more centered composition, and I think this especially shines through when I'm shooting wide angle. There's so much more you're fitting into your frame when you're shooting wide angle. It can become cluttered, it can become more of a challenge to bring the viewer's eyes to your subject. And that's why I think I gravitate towards center framing, because it's a lot easier to direct your viewer right into that subject. Kinda cool. I'd say my best tip for composition is to use the thirds grid when you're shooting. If you're using the mobile app, you can flip it on, and it's so helpful when you're constantly shooting, trying to dial in your composition. And for example, it's like this shot right here. On my screen right here, I have my thirds lines going through, and I can see these two center lines, and I can see the space between them and my head. And I wanna keep that equal, because if I'm swaying too much to the left, or if I'm swaying too much to the right, it's just not helping you focus in on the subject. But when I get in close like this, referencing the two lines, seeing I'm pretty centered in here, your focus is on the subject. And apply that same idea to when you take photographs. Pretty simple, pretty basic, but so helpful. Tip number 2 is foreground. Again, this is another tip that's not just applied to wide angle only, it can be applied to any focal length, but I do believe wide angle showcases it very well. When I was at the marina, I was photographing boats, because that's all there really is there, and in this example coming up, I was using water as the foreground element. You can see how the element of foreground is really helping the shot. But going back to tip number 1, notice how I'm composing the shot when I'm shooting this. My first shot, I kept the boat right in the center of the frame. My second shot, I brought it down to the bottom third line and allowed for more sky and less foreground. And in the final shot, I brought the boat to the top third line, allowing more foreground and less sky. So combine these tips together like that, it's pretty cool. Next tip. Tip number 3, let's talk about shooting indoors. When you're indoors, you're a bit limited on where you can stand, move, and what you can capture, really. When I'm shooting just on the native lens, I find I have to pick and choose what I shoot, and I can't fit the entire space in frame. So when you add that wide angle, you're able to capture that entire space in frame. So here's my living area, and this is what it looks like when I just shot it on the standard lens. It doesn't look bad, but a lot of it's cropped off and it's not really capturing the entire room. So I'll screw it on here, and boom. I'm capturing wall to wall the entire space, and here's me eating some yakisoba. Another example would be shooting inside a car. It's a cramped space and the native lens just isn't gonna cut it. So throw a wide angle on and it will capture the entire space. Here's us on the way to get the yakisoba. You saw us eating in the previous shot. Pretty cropped in there. Throw the wide angle on, and boom. I'm stretching all the way from Billy's right ear all the way to the passenger side mirror. So you might be asking yourself, Andrew, why would I use the moment wide versus the iPhone wide angle that's already built in the 11? Let me tell you. So the native lens here on the iPhone 11 Pro has an aperture of 1.8, whereas the ultra wide, or maybe it's that one, I don't know which one it is, but whatever one it is, it has an aperture of 2.4. In simplest terms, that means the native lens is going to allow more light in, which is going to make your photos a bit more sharp and a little less grainy. You're gonna get a lot better results with that wide angle on the native standard lens. It's just gonna look sharper, allow more light in, all around. It's just a really good decision. So while we're on the subject of the wide angle on the standard lens and how it yields better photo results, I want to talk to you about how it benefits night mode. All right, we're heading out to get some night mode shots on the iPhone. Every night outing needs a snack.
Thanks for choosing Wendy's. What can I get for you?
Hey, could I just do a small Frosty?
Chocolate or birthday cake?
What was that?
Chocolate or birthday cake?
Oh, birthday cake. First taste test. Shout out to Caleb. Oh my. I made a good decision. Out of 10, I give it a 12. But now, we are truly ready to go get night mode shots. Apple introduced night mode on the 11 Pro, and to be honest, going into this, I was thinking it'd be a useful feature to help get cleaner shots at night. I don't know what kind of dark magic they put in the iPhone 11 Pro, but this thing literally took details from shadows I couldn't even see with my eyes and made a photo out of it. It looked similar to this, which was shot on the iPhone's native ultra-wide lens, which you actually can't use dark mode on. You can only use dark mode on the standard lens of the iPhone. So I put the wide angle on the iPhone's native lens, the iPhone 11 Pro worked its dark magic, and boom, there it is. So not having much knowledge on what night mode actually was prior to this blew my mind. And if you're wanting to shoot wide angle photography at night on your mobile device, you'll have to have a wide angle lens to put on the front of the standard native lens. So FYI, next tip.
Good morning. Good morning.
We're gonna talk about some leading lines, and we'll be using the DSLR for this one. So I'm using a Canon 24-70 for this shot because I wanted to show you what leading lines look like at 50 millimeters as well as the difference at 24 millimeters. Billy's helping me out. Shout out to Billy. Here's an example of what it looks like at 50 millimeters, and here's an example of what it looks like at 24. I tried to frame it so my friend Billy looked about the same size in each. And the main thing is they just look different. Like there's no right or wrong. But one thing to note about the 24 millimeters, I believe the foreground helps those leading lines a lot. It almost looks like you're standing on that white line when you're looking at it, and that just draws you into your subject. And with a close view of those overpasses at the top of your frame, it just tunnel visions you that much more into your subject. So leading lines are pretty straightforward. I don't think I need to overcomplicate that, but the one I really want to talk about is how to photograph people on a wide angle lens. So photographing people with a wide angle can be tricky. If you're too close, it might distort them too much, and if you're too far, it might make them too small. When I'm trying to take a portrait of someone, I try to stand close, but not too close. So this shot right here was shot at 50 millimeters, which is obviously not wide angle, but I wanted to illustrate the difference between this 50 millimeter shot and a very similar shot at 24. And obviously the most notable difference is the lighting. It came in really nice for a second. Other than the lighting, let's look at these differences. So on the 50, I was standing probably about 10 feet away from him, and I noticed the background is a bit more blended in at the same level as Billy. And on the 24 millimeter, I was standing much closer, like between 4 and 6 feet. And I noticed the background, I feel, is slightly removed from Billy's position in the photo. No one is right or wrong, but just pointing out my observations. So I went a little closer in just to show the example of how it can maybe be unflattering. And this is shot at 24. And it's pretty close in on him, and I was surprised. I thought it would be a bit more unflattering, but I guess Billy just looks so good. It's hard to take an unflattering photo of the guy. The thing is, if you want to fix the distortion the 24 gets close in, you can do that in post, which we'll go over in just a second, but let's continue on these photos. So shooting full body on wide angle, I think it looks really good. Billy is relatively small in frame, but again, using that center composition and those shadows as the leading lines really draws you right into him. This is a great way to photograph people in a wide angle, keeping this decent distance, and then allowing that wide angle to utilize the leading lines around the subject to draw the viewer right in. And with all the straight lines and whatnot, I noticed some distortion issues, but again, this is all fixable in post. But I think my best tip for photographing people in a wide angle is don't necessarily shoot at 24, go a little bit higher and shoot at 28. I don't know what it is, I can't really give you a good scientific explanation of why I prefer 28, but I always seem to just bump in a little bit when I'm shooting wide angle portraits, and it always ends up right about 28 millimeters. The best reason I can come up with is that it brings the subject in a little bit more in frame and fixes a bit of the distortion. It just looks more natural. It just looks a little more dialed. It looks a little less distorted. Like I said, I don't have like some good explanation for you, but just shoot at 28. It looks nice. It's my favorite focal length. And the last tip I want to talk about is not focusing on the shooting aspect, but focusing on the post-process aspect, where we'll be fixing the distortion of the wide angle images you shot. You can do this on your phone and in Lightroom. I prefer in Lightroom because most of the phone ones, they keep it simple and just rotating your X and Y axis, versus in Lightroom, you can mess around with distortion, aspect ratio, horizontal, vertical. There's just a lot more options to really dial in your image and help the composition and your viewer focus on that subject. I don't really have a very specific directional way of going about it, but I'll usually start off going into the lens correction tab, going to distortion, and just finding what looks right. From there, I'll go to the transform panel. You have a bunch of options available to you there, but I'll usually just stick with the vertical, horizontal, and the aspect ratio of that tab. Here's a few before and afters just to showcase how distortion corrections can really help an image out. So that pretty much sums it, well, no, not pretty much. It definitely, this sums up this video. It's done. So that is all I know about wide angle photography, and I hope you learned something. And I hope to be doing more of these because I really enjoy, I love teaching, man. I hope Moment assigns me more. Do keep in mind, these rules are just not rules. This is just my process and how I go about it, how I think about shooting wide angle and what goes on in here.
The inner machinations of my mind are an enigma.
Take what you want from this video, leave what you don't, and just apply it to your own creative process when you're taking wide angle photos. Or any photos, just like, all these tips are super applicable to like any whatever. Thanks again, and we will see you around. Deuces.